"No farmers on this range," Sergeant Marisol Northcott said, and did not look up from the sign-in sheet. Harlan Tillman had already set his rifle case on the table beside the clipboard she wasn't holding, and he left it there while she finished the sentence with a flick of 2 fingers toward the spectator fence, as if directing traffic that had already learned to move for her. Behind him, the line of paying entrants shifted their weight and looked anywhere but at his coat. A small tin rode in his left coat pocket, no bigger than a snuff can, and his thumb found its edge once, through the canvas, and let it go. He did not open it. The rifle case at his feet was scarred canvas over a wood frame, dulled at the corners the way only decades handle a thing, and it looked, next to the black polymer cases stacked along the registration table, like a plow horse tied up outside a stable of racing stock. 640 entrants had paid an entrance fee to shoot or to watch the Quarry Notch Long-Range Invitational that year, on a private 1,000-yard range that Northcott Defense Solutions had built out of its founder's cattle allotment and turned, in a decade, into the region's proving ground for precision rifles and the software that aimed them. A sponsor review board was scheduled to convene at 4 o'clock that afternoon in a trailer behind the firing line to decide whether the company's training certification would be renewed for another year, a decision worth more to Marisol Northcott than any trophy on the table. 41 shooters were entered to fire for steel at 1,000 yards, and by her own count, printed and laminated and read aloud twice, already that morning, not one of them wore a feed store coat. If you've ever watched someone underestimate a quiet man in old work clothes, you already know how this ends, but not why. "Sir," Marisol said it the way she said everything on that table, briskly, already moving past it. "This is a sanctioned equipment range. Company rifles, company software, company safety officers. It isn't a lot lease, and it isn't a place to walk your own gun in off the tailgate." She glanced once at the case, not long enough to see what was inside it, long enough to file it. "There's a fence line with a real fine view. Coffee's free." He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself, didn't produce a card, didn't ask her to reconsider. He picked the case back up in the same unhurried motion he'd set it down with, touched 2 fingers to the brim of a hat he wasn't wearing out of 35 years of habit, and turned toward the fence the way a man turns from a gate he has already decided is not the only way in. The walk was maybe 60 yards, across gravel that popped under a boot sole gone thin at the heel, past a rack of company rifles gleaming like a dealership showroom, past a bank of a dozen folding chairs where sponsors and county officials would sit, come afternoon, to decide a business's fate over paper cups of the same free coffee. Harlan crossed all of it without once breaking stride to look back at the table, and if anyone had been watching his face instead of his coat, they might have noticed that he did not look offended. He looked like a man arriving early to a place he had already been. At the fence he set the case down in the shade of the sighting tower, and he waited, the way a man waits who has never once in his life been in a hurry to prove anything to a stranger. The house Harlan Tillman kept outside Quarry Notch sat at the end of a gravel spur with a mailbox listing 4 degrees off Plum and a porch that had been reboarded twice, once by him and once, longer ago, by a man he'd paid in eggs. Behind the house ran a single crooked row of apple and pear trees, 7 of them, planted the spring he and Winifred Tillman had married and thinned, over the decades, down to the 4 that still bore. He had pruned that row every February of his life since, and he pruned it still, 8 years after the illness that took her had run its slow course, and left him the only one who remembered which limb she used to lean the ladder against. That morning, before the sun had fully cleared the granary roof, he'd walked the row with his loppers, taken 2 dead water sprouts off the middle pair, and carried a basket of the last autumn's stored fruit, small, wrinkled, sweeter for it, down the 2-track to Delphia Nunnally's mailbox, where he set it on her porch step without knocking and without a note, the way he had done every week he could manage since the first autumn Winifred was gone. Delphia had never once caught him at it. He preferred it that way. Some debts, he'd have said if anyone had ever asked him, aren't paid to be seen paying them. He came back in through the kitchen and stood a while at the counter with his coffee cooling, looking at nothing in particular, and then he went to the bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of a dresser that had been his father's, under two folded quilts Winifred had made and never used, to a cigar box gone soft at the corners. Inside the box, wrapped in a scrap of chamois, was a tin the size of a snuff can, and inside the tin, nested in a bed of oiled felt, were 4 rear sight aperture discs, hand-filed, each drilled and re-drilled decades ago, to a tolerance no catalog would have printed and no machinist would have bothered to hold for a farmer's rifle. He had made them himself, on an evening bench, back when his eyes and his hands could still argue with each other and settle it in his own favor. He hadn't opened that drawer in longer than he could easily say. He opened it now, took the tin, and put it in his coat pocket without taking out a single disc to look at, the way a man carries a key to a door he has no plan to walk through, only the intention of having it on him if the day asked. The rifle came out of the closet in its canvas roll, older than the drawer it had sat beside, older by a fair margin than the company that had built the range he meant to carry it onto. He checked the bolt, ran an oiled patch through the bore out of habit rather than need, and rolled it back up. The truck that carried him into town that morning was 31 years old, a half-ton the color of a fence post, left too long in weather, with a clutch that wanted babying on the second gear, and a bench seat gone slick and shiny in the middle, from decades of a dog that was no longer alive to ride there. It was, by a wide margin, the oldest vehicle that would cross the cattle guard onto Northcott land that day, older than the newest of the company's sponsor trucks by a generation, and Harlan drove it the way he did everything else that concerned him, and no one else, without hurry, without apology, and without the faintest concern for what anyone parked beside him might think of the rust along its rocker panels. The crowd along the Northcott firing line numbered close to 300 by the time the first exhibition shooters stepped to the 1,000-yard line, and Sergeant Marisol Northcott ran that line the way her father had built the company to be run, loud where it needed showmanship, exact where it needed trust. She took the rifle herself for the marquee demonstration, a proprietary bolt gun paired with the company's own ballistic software loaded onto a tablet mounted to the shooting bench, and she called a moving steel target at 1,100 yards, swinging on a cable in a crosswind that had every spotting scope on the line fighting mirage. She read the number the software gave her, adjusted for a gust the wind flags hadn't even caught yet, and put the round through the plate on her first shot, and the crowd came up off the bleachers in a single wave of applause that she accepted with a small, economical nod, the nod of someone who has heard this exact sound enough times that it no longer surprises her, only confirms what she already believed. She was, in that single demonstration, plainly and undeniably good at what she did, and nothing about the rest of that day would change the truth of that shot. It was an hour later, at the folding table by the gate, that Spencer Quimby, 24 years old and 18 months into the job, ran his finger down the sign-in sheet, looking for a name he could not find, and asked the sergeant standing beside him whether the older gentleman by the fence had filled out a rental agreement. "He's not renting," Marisol said, not turning from the tablet where she was logging her own shot data. "He's watching. There's a difference, Spencer, and it's the difference between somebody on our insurance and somebody who isn't. He's got his own rifle, Sergeant. Might just need a waiver form for personal equipment. The system's been calibrated on this range for 6 years, and it has never once returned a bad call." She said it the way she said the phrase, every time a customer questioned a miss, evenly, as if reciting a fact rather than defending one. "I'm not putting an unlisted rifle on a line I'm liable for, so a man in a feed coat can take a turn. If he wants to shoot, there's a public range 40 minutes east of here with dirt berms and no software at all. Give him coffee. Don't give him a waiver." Spencer looked once toward the fence, where Harlan Tillman stood with his hands loose at his sides and his canvas case at his feet, watching the flags the way another man might watch a clock, and something in the shape of the old man's patience made the junior officer hesitate before he folded the waiver form back into its binder without offering it. Harlan did not ask again. 2 more shooters took the line and fired their strings, the crowd murmuring at every hit and every miss, and he watched all of it the way he had watched the demonstration, without comment, without complaint, a man content to let a day prove itself out at its own pace. The first of the two shooters was a young corporal from the County Reserve Unit, sponsored by his employer, shooting a company rifle at 900 yards, and he missed twice on what the tablet called a 4-mile-an-hour crossing breeze before correcting on his third round to a ragged cheer. The second, a retired highway patrolman with steady hands and a borrowed scope, rang steel clean at 800 and took his bow to applause that Marisol led with 2 sharp claps of her own gloved hands. Harlan watched neither man's rifle. He watched the flags on the 200, 500, and 800-yard poles, watched the dust rising off a combine working a wheat quarter a mile past the back berm, watched, longer than either of these, the shimmer of heat coming up off the baked clay flat between the 600 and 700 markers, a low silver ripple that bent and doubled on itself in a way that told him more about the air between here and the far steel than any anemometer bolted to a shooting bench ever could. The company's wind meter sat mounted chest high on a post at the firing line itself, reading local air with real precision and no way at all to see what that same air was doing 300 yards downrange, where the ground broke and the wind, on a day like this, turned. Spencer had drifted back to the fence with a clipboard he didn't use much anymore, a spiral-bound notebook instead, pencil-marked, the kind of log his granddad had kept on a dairy route, and that Spencer had started keeping himself out of the same instinct that makes a young man distrust a number he can't see arrived at. He stood near enough to Harlan that the old man's voice, when it came, didn't have to travel far. "Crossing gust is building past the 700 marker," Harlan said, "coming harder than it's blowing here. Give it 2 more minutes, and it'll be worth a full minute of correction nobody on this line is dialing for." Spencer looked at him, then at the flags, which showed nothing unusual at all from where they stood, then back at the shimmer over the clay flat, which he had watched 100 times without once reading it as anything but heat. He didn't say anything smart back. He flipped 2 pages in his notebook, found the wind reading the software had logged, not 90 seconds before, a flat, confident, 3 miles an hour, steady, and looked up at the 200-yard flag, which was, in that moment, standing out stiff enough to snap. He didn't say the number out loud. He didn't need to. His own eyes had just told him the same thing the old man's had, 300 yards sooner. "That reading's already stale," Spencer said quietly, mostly to himself, and wrote something in the margin of his log that he did not show the sergeant. By the time Marisol Northcott turned back to the sign-in table to find Harlan Tillman still standing at the fence, unmoved, unhurried, and now looking directly at her, the shimmer over the clay flat had thickened into a visible bend, and the far flags at the 1,000-yard marker had begun, almost lazily, to lift. "You're welcome to keep watching," Marisol said, not unkindly, crossing toward him with the tablet under one arm. "But the line's for registered shooters, and we've got a schedule to keep. Sponsors start arriving at 3. "I'd like a turn," Harlan said. "Won't take but 1 shot. I told your young man there's no unlisted rifle going on this line. Insurance won't allow it, and the system's never had cause to make an exception." She'd said the sentence enough times that morning that it came out smooth as a coin worn thin from handling. "You want to shoot a rifle we can verify, I'll rent you one, and we'll talk minute of angle. Otherwise, the fence is the best seat in the house." Harlan didn't argue the insurance. He knelt instead, slow, favoring a shoulder that would not rise past his own chest height, even to unroll a canvas case, and he laid the roll open on the gravel, the way another man might lay out a bedroll for the night, unhurried, each fold falling back in the order it had been folded shut. Inside lay a bolt-action rifle, old enough that its bluing had gone the soft gray of a winter sky, its stock worn pale along the cheek where 40 years of a jaw had rested against it. "That's not on our equipment list," Marisol said, and there was, for the first time that day, the faintest edge under the brisk. "No, ma'am," Harlan said. "It's on mine." He didn't lift the rifle to his shoulder. He leaned into it instead, folding his whole body down and forward around the stock, the way a man settles into a doorway, too low for him, weight coming to rest through his chest and forearms, rather than through an arm that could no longer carry the motion the other way. He worked the bolt once, smooth from 1,000 more repetitions than the crowd behind him could guess at, and he did not touch the tablet, did not glance at the wind meter on its post, did not ask Spencer for a number. "Full minute and a quarter, coming from your left rear," he said, to no one in particular, and then, so quietly that only Spencer, closest to him, caught the second half of it, "building the last 100 yards. It'll hold that long enough." The company software, glowing on the tablet still tucked under Marisol's arm, was reading a 0.2 minute correction at that moment, current, confident, calibrated on 6 years of range data. Harlan's call was more than 6 times that number, in the opposite direction of what any instrument on that firing line had measured in the last 10 minutes. He fired once. The sound of it rolled out flat over the crowd, and for a full 2 seconds nothing at all happened downrange, long enough for a ripple of amusement to start somewhere behind the folding chairs, and then, from 1,000 yards out, faint as a coin dropped in a well, came the ring of steel. Nobody clapped right away. The corporal who'd missed twice at 900 yards was on his feet with his mouth open and no sound coming out of it. The retired patrolman had gone very quiet, looking not at Harlan but at the tablet in Marisol's hands, as if the machine might explain itself before she had to. Somewhere in the crowd, a child asked her father what had just happened and got no answer, because her father didn't know either. Marisol Northcott looked down at the screen, where the correction still read 0.2 of a minute, current, confident, and looked back up at the steel, ringing faintly still on its chain 1,000 yards away, struck dead center by a rifle her system had no data for, on a wind call her system had just insisted, in glowing green numbers, was not there. "That's not," she started, and then stopped, because there was nothing on that screen to finish the sentence with. The applause, when it finally came, was ragged and confused, less a celebration than the sound of 300 people trying to work out, all at once, what they had just been allowed to see. Marisol recovered her voice before the crowd fully recovered its wits, and the first thing she said, once she'd crossed to where Harlan stood breaking his rifle open at the breech, was not a question about the wind at all. "Sir, I need to see a range waiver for that firearm, current insurance, and a valid safety certification before that shot goes on any board of ours." She had the laminated course of fire card in one hand, though she wasn't reading from it, a habit worn smooth as her voice. "The system flagged an anomaly. Until I can account for the rifle, the round doesn't count." Spencer, still holding his pencil log, opened his mouth to say something about the wind reading he'd watched change with his own eyes, and thought better of it in front of 300 witnesses. "I've got a waiver," Harlan said, and produced, from the same coat pocket that held the tin, a folded card gone soft at its creases, a range membership issued years back at a shooting association 2 counties over, its expiration date smudged, but legible enough to argue over. Marisol turned it in her fingers, read the date twice, and shook her head. "This lapsed 11 months ago. I can't score an exhibition shot fired without current coverage. Not with sponsors watching, and our own certification under review this afternoon. I'm sorry, it doesn't count." She said it, and believed it, the way she believed everything that came printed on a form, and if there was relief under the regret in her voice, it was the relief of a woman handed, unexpectedly, a reason not to have to explain a shot her own equipment said should not exist. The sponsor's liaison called twice in the next hour, once to confirm the 4 o'clock review was still on schedule, once to ask, carefully, whether there had been an incident on the line that morning that the board should be briefed on before they arrived. Marisol told him no, a small equipment question, nothing that would affect the certification, and believed that too, right up until Spencer Quimby found her behind the registration trailer, with his notebook open to 3 separate pages, each one bookmarked with a strip of masking tape. "Sergeant, I want to show you something before you talk to them again." He laid the notebook flat on the trailer's fold-down shelf and walked her through it the way he'd have walked a customer through a target card. An entry from 14 months back, a paying shooter who'd missed clean at 900 yards on a day Spencer's own hand log showed a crossing gust the software hadn't registered until 4 minutes after the shot. A second entry, 7 months back, nearly the same story, Same equipment lot number, stenciled faint in the margin, where Spencer noted which rack rifle had been checked out. A third, 2 months back, a young woman who'd left the range in tears after being told, twice, that the miss was hers, that the system had accounted for the wind, and she simply hadn't held her position. All 3 rifles came off the same lot, Spencer said. Rack 4. I didn't think anything of it at the time. A bad day's a bad day. But that's 3 bad days on 4 rifles out of 40, and every one of them blamed on the shooter. Marisol stared at the pages a long moment. Rack 4's ammunition was reordered 3 years ago. Same certified specification we've always run. Reordered from who? She didn't answer that, because she didn't know, because ammunition procurement had never been her desk. It belonged, and had always belonged, to a name on an organizational chart she rarely thought about at all. Orville Vandergrift, Chief Financial Officer, 6 years with the company. The man who signed off on every supplier contract Northcott Defense Solutions carried, and who had never once, in Marisol's memory, set foot on the firing line. If the morning's ring of steel had been a private embarrassment, contained to 1 gate and 1 old man in a feed coat, Spencer's 3 pages of pencil were something else entirely. A pattern, dated, lauded, and sitting in a spiral notebook 2 hours before a sponsor board convened to decide whether this company's name still meant what it had always meant. She called Orville Vandergrift from the trailer, keeping her voice level, and told him what the morning had produced. An unaccountable shot, a lapsed waiver, and now 3 old files that didn't add up the way they should. His response came fast enough that she wondered, later, how long he'd been expecting a version of that call. "Pull the rack 4 rifles," he said. "Get them cleaned and re-racked before Rainey does his inspection. I don't want the colonel walking a dirty gun in front of sponsors and drawing conclusions that aren't his to draw. We'll sort the paperwork after the review." It was, on its face, a reasonable instruction from a man protecting his company's image on a hard afternoon, and Marisol repeated it to Spencer without a second thought, and Spencer, junior enough not to argue with either of them, carried the order back toward Rack 4 with his notebook still open in his hand, carrying, without knowing it, an instruction that would have wiped clean the only physical evidence of what those 3 rifles had actually been firing, had a car not turned in through the front gate at that exact moment, 10 minutes ahead of its own schedule. Colonel Devin Rainey was 61 years old, retired 18 years from active service, and 11 into a second career, consulting on range safety for companies that wanted his name on their letterhead more than his opinion in their operations. And he crossed the gravel toward the sponsor's tent with the gait of a man who had walked a great many firing lines and expected to find nothing on this one he hadn't seen 100 times before. He found Harlan Tillman instead, standing at the fence with his canvas case rolled shut at his feet, and stopped so completely mid-stride that the aide walking beside him nearly collided with his shoulder. "Colonel Rainey," the aide began, already turning toward the sponsor's tent, "if I could introduce you to Sergeant Northcott before." "That's Master Sergeant Tillman," Rainey said, not to the aide, not to anyone in particular, and the correction came out quiet and absolute, the tone of a man restating a fact rather than offering an opinion. He didn't finish crossing to the tent. He crossed to the fence instead, and Marisol, arriving from the trailer in time to see it, watched a man whose name alone could have ended her certification review in either direction stop in front of an old farmer and take his cap off, holding it against his chest with both hands rather than putting it back on. 36 years, Rainey said, and his voice, usually pitched for a room, came out smaller than the room required. "I was 25 years old and about to wash out of that course. You had me holding a dead rest against a fence post because I couldn't stop flinching on the trigger brake, and you never once raised your voice at me the whole 3 weeks, and I've never forgotten it because I've never needed to." He didn't sit down right away. He looked, instead, at the tin Harlan had drawn halfway from his coat pocket, not opened yet, just held, the way a man holds a thing he is deciding whether the moment has earned, and something in the sight of it took the remaining strength out of his knees, so that he lowered himself onto the tailgate of the nearest truck rather than continue standing, sitting down hard, the way a man sits when his legs have simply stopped being consulted. "My boy trained under a sergeant who trained under 2 other men who both came up through your course," he said. "I didn't put it together until right now, looking at that tin, but there's not a live fire lesson my son ever learned that doesn't trace straight back to a wind call you taught somebody 30 years before he was born." Marisol had come close enough by then to hear all of it, the tablet forgotten under her arm, and it was in that stillness that Spencer arrived from Rack 4, one rifle still in his hands, unwiped, uncleaned, exactly as he'd been ordered not to bring it. "Sergeant," he said, holding it out toward her rather than toward the cleaning bench, "I think you need to see the lot stamp on this before anybody touches it." Marisol Northcott took the rifle from Spencer's hands and turned it to the light, and the lot number stenciled faint along the receiver's underside, matched, digit for digit, the number penciled in the margin of his 3 old files. She set it down on the tailgate beside Colonel Rainey without a word, and reached instead for the small tin Harlan had at last drawn fully from his coat. He opened it for her himself. 4 rear sight aperture discs lay nested in oiled felt, each hand-filed, each drilled to a tolerance that predated every machine on that range by decades. And stamped faintly along the tin's inner lid was a unit designation she had seen exactly once before in her life, engraved beneath a black and white photograph that had hung, unremarked, in the lobby of Northcott Defense Solutions since before she was born, a photograph of her own father as a young instructor, standing in a line of men she had never once thought to ask the names of. She looked at the tin. She looked at Spencer's 3 files, laid open now on the tailgate. She looked at the rifle with its unwashed lot stamp, at the wind flag still standing stiff over a range that had told her, all morning, a story her own instruments could not confirm. Her hands, which had held a laminated course card through every demonstration that day without once needing to read it, closed slowly around nothing at all, and she pressed them flat against the tailgate's edge to keep them from doing anything else. "Say what you want," she said finally, and her voice, for the first time since Harlan had set his case down at her gate that morning, had nothing brisk left in it. "Whatever it costs the company, I need to hear it from you, not from a report." Harlan didn't reach for the tin. He let her hold it. "Wasn't your fault what happened to those 3 shooters," he said. "You trusted a machine that was doing the arithmetic right on ammunition. It hadn't fired in 3 years. It wasn't wrong, it was answering a question nobody thought to keep asking it." He nodded once toward Spencer's open notebook. "Tell those 3 people the miss wasn't theirs. Pull that lot before another one stands at your line and gets blamed for weather nobody built your meter to see coming. That's all you want?" It came out of her almost like a plea. "No prize money. No apology on the record, nothing for the coat, the gate, any of it?" "I've got what I came with," Harlan said, and closed his hand, briefly, over the tin's lid before letting her take it back to look at the disc beneath the photograph one more time. He wasn't aiming at the steel. He was aiming at the wind, the way she used to read a coming storm off the orchard leaves, and he was right about it the same way, every time. Winifred had taught herself that reading over 30 years of watching a single crooked row of trees, for the turn in a leaf's underside, that meant weather was coming, whether the radio had said so yet or not. And Harlan had carried the same patient watching out onto 100 ranges before he ever carried it home to her orchard, and he had never once, in either place, needed an instrument to tell him what his own eyes had already settled. Marisol Northcott's composure went out of her all at once, not in tears exactly, but in the sudden loss of the straight-backed posture she had carried since sunup. Her shoulders came forward, her chin dropped, and she stood there at the tailgate, holding her own father's photograph at arm's length, as though seeing, for the first time, a man she had spent her whole career trying to honor, without ever once asking who had taught him. 6 weeks later, the corrected lot number no longer sat in any rack at Northcott Defense Solutions, and the company's sponsor certification, renewed after a review that ran 2 hours longer than scheduled and ended with 3 customer files read into a formal record, carried a new line in its training manual requiring every instructor to call wind by eye before consulting the software, not after. Marisol Northcott taught that lesson herself now, standing at the firing line without the tablet under her arm at all, for the first hour of every new class, pointing new shooters toward the flags, the dust, the shimmer over the clay flat, the way a man had once shown her, without meaning to teach her anything, that a machine can only answer the question it was built to ask. Harlan Tillman was back at his own orchard row within the week, pruning watersprouts off the same crooked pear tree he had pruned every February for going on 50 years, and on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, he carried a basket of the season's first apples down the 2-track to Delphia Nunnally's porch, set it on the step without knocking, and set the small tin down beside it, lid closed, disc resting inside where it had rested for decades between the times it was needed. He straightened slow, one hand at the small of his back, and looked once down the county road, where a truck from Northcott Defense Solutions rolled past at an unhurried pace, flying from its short whip antenna a small corrected certification flag that hadn't existed 6 weeks before. Some of the steadiest hands in any room belonged to the people we waved off at the gate. Harlan Tillman turned back toward his own porch, leaving the basket and the tin exactly where he'd set them, for a neighbor who would never know, and never need to know, who had left them there.